American and British officials are now saying that Russian forces have suffered significant casualties and setback since the war began. As the New York Times put it today, Pentagon officials say a 10% casualty rate, including dead and wounded, for a single unit renders it unable to carry out combat-related tasks. With more than 150,000 Russian troops now involved in the war in Ukraine, Russian casualties, when including the estimated 14,000 to 21,000 injured, are near that level. Joining us now is one of the people bylined on that report. Eric Schmitt is a senior writer covering terrorism and national security for the New York Times. Eric, thank you for being with us. First of all, help me understand the differing claims of the number of soldiers who have died. We get claims from the Ukrainians that are higher than what this estimate that you're reporting on is. How do we determine the accuracy of what the U.S. Intelligence community is saying, that it's somewhere around 7,000 troops in the first 3 weeks of fighting?
These are very difficult numbers to come by, Ali, and it is an imprecise science, to be sure. You've got the Russians who are coming with very low numbers in the high hundreds figures. Then you have the Ukrainians who mentioned are somewhere 13 or 14,000. That's probably well inflated. The Pentagon is looking at those numbers. They look at other social media claims. They're also looking at battle damage assessment. That's the military term for looking at the damage done to tanks, to armored vehicles, other things that troops are in, and basically estimating by the number of troops they know are in these different vehicles, and then extrapolating from that. That will help estimate as well. But even Pentagon officials say the 7,000 figure, while conservative, is an imprecise one, and they're searching for better ways to get a better handle on it. But that is the number that they're going with right now, and it is, as you said in your opening report, quite staggering.
It is staggering. We've also heard that between 3 and 4 generals have been killed. An investigation into one of them is whether or not they were using an unsecured cell phone or a radio that allowed them to be geo-targeted. These kind of losses are the one thing that U.S. intelligence, which was otherwise very accurate about before this invasion, the one thing they were off on was the speed with which Russia would be able to overtake Ukraine. That is, it's just unfolding unlike anything anyone expected.
That's right. The Russians, by all accounts, felt they could get into Kyiv, the capital, within 1 or 2 days, basically take over the leadership there, and then probably take over most of the country in the next week or two. That obviously hasn't happened for a couple of big reasons. One is just the fierce resistance they met from the Ukrainians, as your report is documented right now. The other thing is they overestimated their own capabilities going into Ukraine. Serious logistics problems, shortages of fuel, of food, of spare parts. We've heard of widespread reports of conscripts, young and inexperienced troops who were not told they were going into a war zone, basically walking away from some of their vehicles and some of these convoys we've heard that have been stalled going into Kyiv. So it's been a collection of errors on the logistical side. It's also been a flawed campaign of the ground forces not really being synced up with the air forces in a normal way you'd had your battle. And so what they've had to do is resort to the tactics that your earlier report mentioned, stand back and pummel these cities with artillery, long-range missiles, and some aerial bombing.
And again, to people who are not sort of trained in understanding military techniques, it's hard to understand. But really, this means you can't be bombing or shelling a city or shelling locations where your troops are located. So if the ground troops are not able to do what they're supposed to do, now what we're seeing is, as Cal was reporting, Russian troops retreating from those positions, sometimes leaving dead Russian soldiers behind while they call in air support, which then bombards an area. It's an inefficient way of doing things, to say the least.
That's right. It's quite a brutal way of doing things. What's happening is on the outskirts of all these cities you've mentioned, the Ukrainian forces are basically fighting the much numerically superior and technologically superior Russian forces roughly to a standstill. So rather than being able to advance further and enring most of these cities, the Russians are having to stand back and use the one weapon they do have a lot of, and that is artillery and these missiles, and basically weapons of terror at this point, forcing the civilian population to flee, damaging much of the cities, and basically trying to take over from there. What we haven't seen yet is urban combat.
And
that is the Russians trying to get inside of the streets of these cities. That's where it could get really bloody and really bad, even worse than what we've seen now.
In the few instances where we have seen that, however, it seems initially the Ukrainians seem to have an advantage in places like Kyiv, where they have sort of retreated to areas that they control inside the city to draw Russians in. It seems to result in some confusion, obviously, because the Russian soldiers don't know the landscape. They don't know the territory as well. So that becomes advantage Ukrainian forces.
Absolutely. The Ukrainians know the terrain. They're fighting on their home turf, and they're highly motivated to defend their homeland, whereas we've seen the Russian morale, whether it's at the conscripted troops force all the way up to some of these general officers you mentioned, it's somewhat in disarray now. Morale is bad. They're not really fighting for a cause they believe in, whereas the Ukrainians, rallied by President Zelensky, are fighting hard, unexpectedly hard, and hanging in there. Again, we'll see how long this can last, though, because, again, the Russian military, one of the strongest in the world, going up against Ukraine now, it's a tough fight all the way around.